There are stories that do not sleep, even when the world forgets them. They linger in the dust that settles on forgotten altar stones. They hum behind locked doors in ruined wings of silent palaces. And they pass from whisper to whisper among those who still remember how to listen to the walls. And tonight, we return to one such place. To a chapter not written in any official history, a tale erased from ledgers, forbidden in court, and sealed beneath a floor that no longer exists. It begins, not with a triumph or a coronation, but with a smell thick, sweet, and rotten, a scent that filled the eastern wing of Château Sandeni long before anyone dared to speak of what had happened there. It was the third hour of the night when a castle guard, young and tired, and still new to the night shift, paused beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Queen's corridor. He had not heard a cry, nor seen a light, but something in the air made him stop, something heavy and unnatural, like meat left in the sun, soaked in old wine, and milk turned sour. He turned his head, frowned, whispered a prayer under his breath, and kept walking. What he did not know, what no one outside that room could know, was that at that moment, Queen Jean of the Valois line was giving birth in total darkness, without witnesses, and with a curse clinging to her breath. She was only 4 months into her pregnancy when the labour began, but her body had long been locked in fever. Her windows were boarded, the stone cracks in her chamber sealed with cloth and tallow to keep the air from shifting. She had been kept in sweltering silence, isolated under decree, with no physician by her side. The royal doctor had been sent away to tend to a dying duke in Rouen, and the only one left, the only one who dared to approach her bed, was Ellen, an elderly herbalist once exiled from court, forbidden by law to touch the blood of royalty, let alone the womb of a reigning queen. But laws have no weight in the hour of desperation, and so it was Ellen who laid trembling hands on the Queen's swollen belly, and Ellen who received what came forth, a thing that was not alive, but not kite still, wrapped in its own rot, slick with mucus, the colour of ink and jaundice, and stinking before it ever touched the air. Later, when the scribes were forced to pen an official account, they wrote only a single line: the child was born without signs of life, its flesh marked by visible decay. They did not write of the way the midwife stumbled into the hallway moments later, her face ashen, and her eyes wide with something that had no name. They did not record the way the old chaplain walked slowly behind her, holding a bundle wrapped tightly in black cloth, with both arms stiff, as though he feared the thing inside might shift or whisper, if jostled. And they did not say what every servant knew by dawn, that the swaddling itself was so foul it had to be burned, that it would not wash clean, and that even fire took longer than usual to consume it. The Queen survived, but something inside her did not leave with the child. For 3 days, she spoke to no one. She lay on her back beneath heavy sheets, her skin pale and unresponsive, her lips moving in silence, as though finishing prayers no one else had started. Her eyes did not close. Her body did not rest. By the 6th day, spots began to appear on her abdomen, soft, dark bruises that grew beneath the skin like ink dropped in water, and whispers filled the palace halls that she had not birthed a child, but a curse. And still she remained alone in that sealed room, breathing the thick air, her hands unmoving. While those outside crossed themselves each time they passed her door, servants began to complain of sounds breathing that was not hers, shuffling in the night, the hiss of something too wet to be silk sliding across stone. Some claimed they heard her speaking in an unknown tongue. Others said she no longer moved at all, but her eyes followed them through the keyhole. Even when the door was locked, they burned incense by the cartful, draped fresh linens across the floor, and brought in monks to chant through the night. But nothing stayed the rot that had begun to bloom in her body. When the physician returned from Rouen, he locked the doors, sealed the windows, and declared no one should enter, not even the confessor, until the Queen could be cleansed. And yet, Noch cleansing came, her skin began to split. Her hair fell out in long, tangled clumps, and her abdomen oozed a pale, foul-smelling liquid that no cloth could soak through. No one dared to dress her wounds. No one dared to touch her skin. They changed her wrappings in silence and left vinegar-soaked cloths by her bedside, never daring to look beneath the gauze, and the smell thick and impossible seeped through the walls. One monk said it was not the stench of death, but something worse, the scent of a body trying to die and being refused. They called for rituals. Monks from Toulouse came with holy ash and soot-black robes. They marked her doors with ancient symbols, chanted over her bed, and watched in silence as the lanterns dimmed on their own and the curtains dripped with moisture that came from nowhere. One morning, a handprint was found on the stone wall, dark, upraised, wet, as if freshly pressed, but no one had entered, and no one had knocked. The monks left without explanation, their voices hoarse, and refused to return. By the end of the 5th week, the eastern wing was deserted. Servants vanished without notice. Guards refused the post. A young noble scalded his face with hot wax and hurled himself into the monastery well. The official story said, madness. The unofficial one said something worse had brushed against him in the night. Still, the council remained silent. Still, the queen did not die. So they built a chamber of wood, sealed from floor to ceiling, inside her own room, not to protect her, but to contain her, and placed her inside it, still breathing, still silent, still leaking a fluid no one could name. The carpenter who built it left a note behind. It read, "Her mattress has melted. Her skin is not her own. Her breath is not alone." He fled the next morning and was never seen again. And so, the chamber was sealed. The name was stripped from court documents. The wing was boarded, then burned, and the only phrase left in the royal record was this: "She departed to the Lord in the times of silence and shadow." But even now, in the cloisters of old monasteries and among the pages of forgotten chronicles, the story survives. No tomb holds here. No monument bears her crest. But those who have heard the whispers say the same thing, over and over again. In the hush of candlelight and the rustle of leaves at night, she did not die. She waits. They said the child never cried, that it came into the world not with breath, but with silence, a silence so deep and so unnatural that the midwife's hands began to tremble before she even caught sight of its face. There was no struggle, no final push, no scream from the queen's lips, only the sound of something wet striking stone, and then a stillness that made the candle flames flicker as though reacting to something unseen. It was not the silence of peace or of sleep. It was a silence shaped like a question, stretched long and cold across the walls of that sealed chamber. A silence that seemed to stare back. The midwife Helen, a woman who had seen 30 births in her time, including stillborn twins and one child born with its heart outside its chest, would later say that she knew something was wrong the moment her hands touched the child's skin. It was cold, not with the chill of death, but with something deeper, a dampness that came from within, as if the body had already begun the process of returning to the earth before it ever touched life. The skin peeled in places, grey and blackened, soft like old fruit, around the chest and under the arms. It was slick with something that clung like oil, but smelled like decay, and when she lifted it to wrap in cloth, she swore its mouth had opened slightly, not to cry, but to release a breath that carried the scent of the grave. But Helen did not scream. She did not run. Instead, she swallowed hard, wrapped the child in the only cloth available, a black mourning shawl once draped over the Queen's mirror, and handed it wordlessly to the waiting chaplain. He held it as if it might disintegrate in his hands. His face was pale. His mouth opened and closed without sound. He did not bless the child. He did not ask for its name. Instead, he turned, walked slowly into the corridor, and disappeared down the stair without another word. Later, they would ask him what he had seen. He never answered. He died 3 weeks later, his body found curled in the chapel corner, clutching the remains of the shawl, which had turned stiff and brittle as bark. Its edges burned as if touched by flame, though no fire had ever come near it. The only words written in his final note were, "We should not have seen it." By dawn, the cloth had been burned, not out of tradition, but out of desperation. The fire took longer than it should have. The fabric hissed and writhed in the flames, and the smoke that rose from it was thick and yellow. Those who stood near claimed it left a taste on their tongues, something bitter, metallic, and wrong. One servant fainted. Another vomited in the garden. The ashes were gathered with gloves and buried beneath the cobblestones of the eastern courtyard. And though they salted the ground and blessed it 3 times, no grass ever grew there again. The bed where the queen had lain was stripped and pulled apart. Its wooden legs cracked from the weight of her labour. The mattress, soaked through with blood and other fluids no one could name, was dragged by 6 men to the inner courtyard and burned. But even after the flames took it, the stone beneath remained damp. The surgeon who entered the room 3 days later claimed he could still see traces of yellowish fluid clinging to the cracks between the floorboards, not blood, not mucus, not anything he had ever seen before. He refused to return, and when pressed, simply said, it left behind more than stains. The queen, meanwhile, spoke to no one. She lay with her hands folded above her belly, unmoving, unblinking, whispering at times in the dead of night. A young maid who was sent in to remove the basin of dirty water came running from the chamber, pale as wax and crying. She said she had heard 2 breaths, not one coming from the bed, one heavy and laboured, and one light and quick, as though a child still lingered there, unseen but present, curled against its mother's chest. The maid was dismissed, and her name was never spoken again. In the days that followed, they sealed the birthing chamber with boards soaked in vinegar. The stone was scrubbed with salt water. The air was thick with incense, so heavy that even the birds refused to land on the windowsills. The queen's linen was changed daily, but the blood returned. Not fresh blood, not the bright red of healing, but dark, slow, syrupy blood, thick with threads like hair. One cloth was found moving slightly, pulsing as if something beneath it still had life. They burned that cloth in silence, saying no prayers. Word of the birth, or whatever had taken its place, began to spread, but not in the form of proclamations. Instead, it spread through the shivering voices of the palace staff, through the hunched shoulders of the monks who passed each other in the chapel without making eye contact, through the sudden illness of the page, boy who had helped carry the firewood to the courtyard and woke up with lesions down his neck. No one knew what to say, but all of them felt it, a heaviness in the walls, a thickness in the air, a sense that something had come into the world that could not be named and could not be undone. The court's official scribes were ordered to record the birth as a tragic, stillborn event, a common sorrow of queens and mothers throughout history. But even they hesitated to write it plainly. One line, blackened and crossed out in the margin of an early draft, read simply, "The child was not human." No one ever asked what became of the body. It was assumed to have been buried, or burned, or perhaps entombed in some forgotten chamber beneath the chapel. But years later, when a fire broke out in the lower vaults, a priest who assisted in the evacuation claimed he had found a small cloth-wrapped object sealed behind a wall. He did not touch it. He did not open it, but he swore that as he passed, he heard the sound of something breathing, not heavily, not audibly, but just enough to freeze his spine and twist his mouth into silence. That priest vanished 2 days later. His robes were found folded at the edge of the river. His cross was missing. No body was ever found. The queen's body began to change. Her skin grew paler, then blotched, then thin as paper. Her eyes no longer closed. She did not eat. Her breath remained steady but shallow. At night, the guards swore they saw flickering shapes move beneath the crack of her door, though no candle burned within. One morning, a wet stain appeared on her bed that would not dry, even after 3 attempts with salt and incense. When they lifted the mattress, they found black roots clinging to the underside, pulsing gently like something still alive. No one could say when the whispers began the rumors that the child had not died. Not truly. That the thing born from her womb had slipped into her flesh instead of departing it. That her body was not recovering but transforming. That something had been left behind, a seed. A parazit. A spirit. No one could agree. But all of them knew it had not gone. And that is where we leave this chapter. With the memory of a child who never cried. A queen who never healed. And a chamber that no one dared open. Whatever was born that night beneath the veiled windows of Château Sandeni left behind no footprints. No name, nor grave. But it left behind a scent. And it left behind a silence. The kind of silence that lives in stone. The kind that waits to be heard again. The human body is not meant to bloom. Not in the way. Flowers do not from within. And not in silence. But the queen's flesh, they said, did not decay like a corpse. It unfolded. It softened. It opened in places where skin should not open. And from those places came the slow, sticky scent of something, trying to become more than flesh or less. Some said it was infection. Others, divine punishment. But for those who stood in the corridor outside her chamber, holding cloth to their mouths, what crept through the air was not disease. It was memory. The memory of the child that had not lived and of the womb that would not die. By the end of the 2nd month, the queen no longer resembled the woman painted on the coins, or the one whose portrait had hung in the council chamber draped in violet and lace. That image, her chin proud, her gaze calm, had been removed without ceremony. The frame left empty. They did not announce it. No one asked why, but those who passed the wall where the painting once hung swore the light there never returned to normal, that it remained a little dim, a little wrong, as if the wall itself refused to forget. Inside her chamber, her skin had begun to crack, not in thin, jagged lines, but in thick, deep fissures that split across her abdomen and thighs. At first, the palace physicians called them pressure ulcers, the result of long confinement, unmoving limbs, too much damp. But then the edges began to lift. The skin did not peel like parchment. It curled. It softened into a kind of wet petal, pink and weeping. Each bloom a wound that did not bleed. And from the center of each lesion rose a smell not sharp, not sour, but sweet, sickly sweet, like fruit left beneath altar candles. Soaked in mildew and forgotten prayers, the servants no longer entered alone. They came in pairs, glancing sideways, their fingers wrapped in cloth, their mouths tight with the taste of vinegar. They did not speak while inside. They did not pray. Instead, they worked quickly, changing the linens and wiping the sweat that gathered on her chest and neck. Though her body had long since gone cold, her lips no longer moved. Her eyelids did not flutter, but she breathed, faintly, steadily, and her eyes open always tracked movement in the shadows, not with fear or need, but with a deep and quiet knowing. She did not blink when they approached. She did not flinch when the cloth touched her skin. But when one maid leaned too close, her ear accidentally grazing the queen's mouth, she swore she heard words. "He's still here." She did not return the next day. Her name was struck from the palace rolls, and no one inquired after her again. The chamber itself had begun to change. Mold crept up the baseboards in soft grey threads. Curtains sagged with damp. The mirror on the far wall, once shrouded in mourning cloth, now showed nothing at all, not even the flicker of the lantern flame. It reflected no light, no movement, only a dull smear of darkness that pulsed ever so slightly when the room fell still. One monk claimed he had seen a second figure in the reflection, something curled, small, swaddled in black. But when he looked directly, there was only the queen. The bed had collapsed on one side, the wood rotting through where her body pressed down. The mattress could no longer be lifted without tearing. Its inner stuffing, once goose feather and wool, had turned to pulp. When the linens were pulled away, the wood beneath wept a yellow fluid that smelled of honey and bile. The scent was strongest near her legs, where the ulcers had deepened and widened, revealing beneath them not bone or blood, but something that shimmered faintly in the dark white strands, soft and moist, curling like roots in soil. Physician Fouquet, the last of his colleagues who still dared enter, made detailed records by candlelight, though his hands shook and his notes became less legible with each passing day. He wrote of the ulcers in clinical terms at first: necrosis, liquefaction, epidermal separation. But by the 6th week, his language changed. He called the wounds blossoms, and the tissue beneath them tangled growth. He noted that the queen no longer responded to light, to heat, or to the touch of metal, but her eyes dilated whenever a certain psalm was read aloud, specifically, the verses of mourning for the firstborn. He stopped quoting scripture after that. At night, the chamber glowed faintly from within, not from lanterns, but from the damp along the stone, which caught the moonlight in an unnatural way, shimmering with a pearly sheen. The guards posted outside did not last long. One left his post before sunrise, dragging his armor behind him, muttering about flowers growing where there was no soil. Another scratched his own arms raw and insisted he could hear the queen breathing from every corner of the castle, as if her breath had soaked into the walls. When he disappeared, no one searched for him. The rot did not stay in her body alone. The linens, even when boiled in lime, came back spotted. Her bandages, always soaked, always warm, were found to smell not of sweat or blood, but of lilies, heavy, or verreep lilies, the kind left on graves long after the funeral, the kind no one wants to take home. And all the while, she never moved. There came a morning when the entire eastern corridor was empty. No birds sang near the windows. No pages swept the floors. No servants approached. A small dish of water left outside her door had turned cloudy overnight. And inside it, curled like a seed, was a single dark hair, but not human. Thin, translucent, segmented, and still twitching slightly in the sun. The monk who found it buried it in the garden without a word. A meeting was called not in the council chamber, but in the chapel basement, far from where her breath might reach. There, the duke, the archbishop, the chancellor, and 2 guards who had seen too much gathered in shadow to decide what could no longer be postponed. Physician Fouquet was brought in, and when asked directly whether the queen was dying, he said nothing for a long time. Then he whispered, "No, she is not dying. She is changing." They asked him into what. He did not answer. That night, no light was seen from her chamber. No sounds were heard, but a soft hum, like breath drawn through wet grass, moved through the eastern walls. The lanterns in the west wing dimmed. The bells in the abbey tower rang once, without hands to pull the rope, and in the silence that followed, the queen still and rotting, with skin that no longer bled and breath that no longer warmed the air, opened her mouth, though no one was there to hear it. There are sounds that do not echo, not because the stone refuses them, but because they are too quiet to be called sound at all. These are the whispers born in places that forget the sun, in corners where incense has long since faded, and prayers are recited only from memory. It was that kind of whisper that began to slip through the walls of the eastern wing. Not a voice, not a cry, but something softer than thought, heavier than breath, and closer than skin. The guards were the first to notice it, though none admitted it aloud. They began to avoid standing too near the Queen's door, lingering instead by the inner stair or pretending to inspect the torch brackets, eyes never quite meeting the cracks between the stones. When asked, they said it was the smell, but the truth was quieter. Each of them, on different nights, had felt it, the sense that something was standing just behind them, not touching, not moving, just waiting, as if the wall itself had drawn breath and leaned forward to listen. At first, the whispers came only at night, a soft brushing, like fingers dragged slowly across the inside of stone. Then came fragments, phrases, hums, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in the nursery tongue of Gascon mothers. One guard claimed he heard his own name spoken, not in warning or invitation, but in a tone of simple acknowledgement, as though whatever was inside had always known him and merely waited for him to return. The walls of Château Sandeni had been built for defense, not comfort. They were thick, rough-cut, and cold, the kind of stone that remembered war more easily than peace. Yet in that wing, the walls grew warm, not with heat, but with moisture, a dampness that rose slowly, like breath trapped beneath cloth. The tapestries began to stain. Patches of discoloration spread like bruises. The air grew thick. By the end of the third month, no one touched the walls. Not with bare hands, not with gloves. A boy from the scullery, sent to dust the hall sconces, brushed his shoulder against the stone and cried out. His arm blistered. His voice cracked. He did not speak again. And when they unwrapped the bandage, the skin bore not a wound, but a Mark V, small impressions, like the pressure of fingertips pressing gently, firmly, impossibly inward. The monks began to avoid the eastern wing altogether. Their chanting ceased. The chapel bells rang only during daylight, and even then, only in short bursts. A new rule was passed: no mass after dusk. No prayer spoken aloud within 100 steps of her chamber. The archbishop himself walked the hallways once more, baits in hand, robes trailing incense. But he did not enter. He paused at the threshold, bowed his head, and whispered something too softly for even his aide to hear. Then he turned and ordered the iron nails reforged for the chamber's wooden seals. "The walls are not enough," he said. "Something is reaching." There were rumors. Of course, not all of them came from servants. Some from councilmen, some from the kitchens, some from the town beyond the gates, where the light from the castle was visible each night, or at least used to be. People claimed to see movement in the high eastern window, a silhouette pacing, a flicker of something not quite shaped like a woman. Others swore the castle bells rang on nights they were not supposed to, that animals shied away from the castle road, that children born in the nearby villages had begun to sicken, that their flesh bruised too easily, that their cries were silent. One mother, mad with grief, came to the gates with a bundle in her arms, demanding to return the curse. She threw the cloth at the feet of the guards and screamed until her voice broke. But when they unwrapped the bundle, there was nothing inside. No child, only soil, damp, red-tinged soil, and a single strand of dark hair that curled like ivy around itself. Inside the palace, the walls whispered still. Servants who had never entered the chamber began to dream of it. One awoke screaming that she had walked barefoot across the queen's floor and felt her own heartbeat echo from beneath the stones. Another claimed she heard a lullaby sung from beneath the bed. The head cook, a man who had served 3 generations of monarchs, left without notice. His note read, I can taste it in the bread. She is in the bread. More troubling still was the change in those who had stood watch near the Queen's chamber for too long. They spoke less, slept little, their eyes grew dull, but their hands trembled with constant motion, rubbing, picking, touching the walls as if expecting something to reach back. One man took to pressing his ear against the stone and smiling faintly, as though listening to an old song. When asked what he heard, he simply said, "She hums to me." The council met in private. No minutes were taken, no agreement signed. But when they rose from the long wooden table, their faces were pale, their mouths drawn tight, and a new decree was issued. No one, under any title or office, was to speak the Queen's name again, not in record, not in ritual, not even in memory. She was now the bearer of the breathless wing. That was all. No title, no bloodline, no face, no crown, but names, once spoken, do not die easily. In the stone, in the walls, in the whispering hollows behind closed doors, something still answered to her name, and whether it was memory, or mercy, or madness, no one could say. Only that by the time the winter snow began to fall, the walls of Château Sandeni were no longer just stone. They had learned to listen, and something deep within them had learned how to speak back. There comes a moment long after fever has passed and silence has settled, when a body no longer belongs to the person it once held. It becomes something else. A container, a reminder, a map, perhaps, written in veins and softened bone. But in the Queen's case, her body did not become less than human. It became something that looked back, something that responded, something that whispered not with lips, but with movement beneath the skin. No one had touched her directly in over 30 days. Cloth was changed with sticks and tongs. Bowls of rosewater were left by the door, never refilled. Her linens were replaced only when the stench grew thick enough to choke. But those who entered, and they were few, began to speak of motion, subtle and rhythmic, just below the surface of her belly and thighs. At first, they called it twitching, a final reflex of dying nerves. But twitching does not follow patterns. Twitching does not respond to voices. Twitching does not move from one place to another, like a finger tracing its way through a maze of veins. Physician Fouquet returned once more. Against his better judgment, he wore gloves soaked in camphor and held a candle close to her abdomen. Watching, for nearly a full minute, nothing stirred. Then, as he recited a passage from his medical notes, dry, clinical, safe, the skin beneath her navel lifted. Not sharply, not like a wound, slowly, smoothly, as though something inside had pressed upward to listen. He dropped the candle. It went out. Later, he would write in the margins of his journal, "Movement is not heartbeat. It is not breath. It is not digestion. It is direction." From that day forward, the word parasite was forbidden in palace records. So was host. So was infestation. But the fear remained, unspoken and growing, like the swell of something hidden behind a closed curtain. The Queen's skin, once soft and pale, had darkened in irregular blotches, some bruised violet, others grey, others the yellowish hue of parchment steeped in smoke. Beneath those spots, the movement grew stronger. At times it rippled slow and circular, like fingers pressing from within. Other times, it throbbed in waves, pulsing up her side and into her chest. Her collarbone rose and fell as if something beneath it were crawling toward the throat. One servant described it as watching a fish try to swim under ice. Another refused to speak, pressing her hands to her own belly and weeping, though she did not know why. By the 5th week, the lesions on the Queen's back had softened and opened, not deeply, but enough for pale filaments to emerge, not bone, not flesh, but something in between. Soft, white, thread-like. They moved slowly when exposed to air, curling and uncurling as if tasting the room. They retreated when touched with salt. They burned when exposed to holy water. And yet, they always returned. A priest from the southern monastery of San Gil was called young, untested, but devout. He entered with the Book of Hours, and a thurible burning thick clouds of lavender and coal. He lasted less than 7 minutes. When he emerged, his mouth was filled with blood, not from injury, but from biting down on his own tongue. He did not speak again. His hands never stopped trembling. Later, in his room, he wrote a single line over and over in the margins of his prayer book. It is not her. It is not her. It is not her. The skin around her eyes had tightened. The lips had dried and cracked. Yet never blue. Her hair was gone entirely, but fine growths, not hair. Not mould had begun to appear around the crown of her skull. They shimmered faintly in candlelight. Some believed they moved in time with her breath. Others claimed they pulsed to a rhythm not heard by human ears. One day, a monk named Bastian Young, solemn, barely 20, stood in the hallway outside her chamber for a full hour, his ear pressed to the door. When asked why, he smiled faintly and said, "She asked me to." When pressed further, his smile faded. Not the voice, the skin. No one believed him. No one dismissed him either. In the following days, several documents disappeared from the palace library. Old anatomical charts, field journals from plague doctors, a bound volume of monastic cautions on living decomposition, a report from the royal astrologer, never published, suggested a correlation between the Queen's condition and a rare planetary convergence. The stars, he claimed, had paused the night of the birth, just for a moment, as if watching. By now, those who still served her did so without speaking, without praying, without writing her name on any document. Some began to wear strips of black cloth tied around their necks, not as mourning, but as a ward. Others placed salt lines in their shoes. No one entered alone. The castle walls, once filled with the shuffle of servants and the tap of heels on stone, had fallen nearly silent. And within that silence, she lay still, but never truly still. There were moments, rare and terrifying, when her body arched slightly, her spine lifting off the ruined bed. Her hands did not move. Her eyes did not blink. But the skin along her ribs would stretch, and the sound of muscle tearing could be heard softly beneath the layers of cloth. And then, the skin would fall flat again, as if whatever had stirred within her had decided, for now, to sleep. One physician, nameless, cautious, too old to be frightened, removed a sliver of tissue from a weeping lesion on her side. He placed it in a sealed vial and took it to the lower vault. But the next morning, the vial was found shattered. Not broken, shattered as if burst from within. The shelf around it was covered in condensation, and the stone beneath was pocked with small craters, as though something had eaten through it and then disappeared. After that, no one touched her again. There were no more examinations, no more rituals. The last candle in her room was extinguished. The door was sealed once more, not with iron or wood this time, but with wax. The monks traced symbols into it. The archbishop signed the seal with trembling hands, and beneath it all, the faint sound of breath could still be heard. Slow and irregular, like the turning of a page in a book too old to remember its story. What lived beneath her skin had not yet finished becoming, and the body of the Queen, what remained of it, was no longer hers alone. The soul, they say, leaves the body gently like mist, lifting from a still lake, or like breath rising in cold air just before dawn. It does not linger. It does not struggle. It simply Let's go. But in the case of Queen Jean, nothing left. Or perhaps something did, and something else took its place. Something that knew how to keep the lungs rising and falling. How to keep the blood thick enough to warm. How to keep the eyes open long after they stopped seeing. What lay in the sealed chamber of the eastern wing still breathed. But no one dared to say she was alive. They no longer brought food. They no longer changed the cloth. The last linens had long since fused to her skin. Now part of her, or rather, of what she was becoming. The bed beneath her had collapsed completely, and her body lay upon a thick, pulpy mass of darkened fabric, oozing through the cracks in the floorboards. The air had grown so heavy that candles refused to stay lit. Not from wind, but from something denser, an invisible presence that pressed down against flame, against voice, against reason. Even whispers outside her door came slower now, as though the words themselves feared being heard. And still, she breathed. At first, they measured the rhythm slow, consistent, shallow. But then came the changes. Hours without breath. Minutes where her chest did not move. Then, all at once, a gasp drawn not in desperation, but in certainty, a choice, a claiming. The physician who had dared to record this change marked it not as a medical anomaly but as a sign. It breathes by will, not by need, and yet the eyes remained open milky now, ringed in bruised yellows and fading blue. The pupils no longer contracted in light, but they followed movement. They stared at the door even after it was sealed. They watched the stone ceiling as if reading something etched in a language only she could see. No one knew what thoughts remained. No one knew what she remembered. But her mouth never moved. Her tongue had withered. Her teeth had been found loose upon the pillow weeks before. And still she breathed. The monks refused to enter. They left their offerings at the edge of the corridor, pots of vinegar, fresh wrappings, chalk for ceiling. None were touched. Some were returned marked with smears dark. Not quite blood. Not quite ink like fingerprints blurred with water. One monk swore he heard singing inside the room at midnight. Not loud, not melodic, but steady, a low hum made of many voices. None of them fully formed. They called her she who breathes without a soul. Not out of poetry, but necessity. The Queen's name had been stricken from every wall, every prayer, every official scroll. In its place were gaps, omissions, as precise as wounds stitched shut. Council documents referred to the chambered presence. Royal letters described her as the body under protection. Only in private. In corners of corridors and over shaking cups of broth. Why did the truth come through? She was still there. And she would not leave. The Archbishop, pale and withered from lack of sleep, penned a private tract no one was meant to see. In it, he described the last visit made by a priest of the old rites, not from the church, but from the mountains near St. Etienne, where no gospel was ever canonized. The priest had entered barefoot. He brought no torch, no book. He spoke nothing. But when he emerged, he held one hand to his chest and whispered, "There is no soul inside, but something remembers how to breathe." He died 3 days later. His heart had stopped, but there were no signs of struggle. Only a faint smile and a single mark above his sternum, a circle, pressed as if by a fingertip into the skin, faintly bruised. Inside the sealed chamber, the walls had begun to blister, not with heat, but with moisture patches where the stone grew soft, almost pulpy, sweating a thin film of something that glowed faintly in darkness. The glow could not be seen during the day, but at night, from the high balcony overlooking the eastern wing, the guards reported seeing the light rise through the cracks of the boarded windows, like the glow of embers buried deep beneath ash, flickering not with heat, but with hunger. The guards were changed weekly now. Some refused to stay more than one shift. One was found in the stable, curled beneath a bale of hay, eyes wide open and blood leaking from his nose, his mouth full of torn parchment. Another disappeared entirely. His sword was found outside the Queen's door, buried point first into the stone. No one could explain how it had pierced granite, and still, she breathed. The breath no longer sounded human. It was slower, heavier, drawn through a throat that had long since collapsed inward. At times, it rasped. At times, it trembled. But always, it came, and with each breath, the air around the chamber thickened, as though she exhaled not air, but memory, not scent, but presence. Those who had once spoken of exorcism now remained silent. There were no more holy rites, no more consecrations. The altar boys had been dismissed. The candles in the eastern corridor were allowed to die, and the choir sang only in the western wing, never after nightfall. A letter arrived from Rome. It bore no seal, no signature, only 5 words written in black ink. The edges of the page scorched. Do not attempt resurrection. Contain. No one replied. But containment is a fragile thing. A room sealed in wood can burn. A wing nailed in iron can rust. A name erased from books can live on in breath and breath. After all, was all she had left. She did not cry. She did not move. But her presence grew. It filled the spaces where sound should be. It clung to robes. It followed footsteps, and those who stood too near her door began to feel it, a warmth that was not heat, a pressure that was not touch, a voice that was not sound. The soul, they say, departs with peace. But she remained, and whatever watched through her eyes, breathed through her lungs, and pulsed beneath her skin, it was not waiting to die. It was waiting to be named. At first, it was only the castle that held the breath, the heaviness, the pause in prayer, the sense that something unseen was listening, and perhaps worse, remembering, but slowly, like smoke that slips through mortar cracks, like rot that spreads through the roots before the leaves ever fall. What lived inside the eastern wing began to stretch outward. It did not march. It did not roar. It exhaled. And what it exhaled was not air. It began with the children, in a village just beyond the castle gates. A mother brought her newborn to the midwife 2 days after birth. The child would not feed. Its skin was pale, tout pâle, with a waxy sheen. The soles of its feet were tinged blue. The midwife warmed it, swaddled it, sang to it, but the child made no sound. Its mouth remained closed, not clenched. Not asleep sealed. When the midwife tried to open it, she found no tongue, no throat, just smooth tissue where a cry should have lived. That same night, the church bell in that village rang twice, though no one pulled the rope. A week later, in the township of Vire, 3 infants were stillborn, each with peeling skin and bruises along the spine. One was said to have opened its eyes before it died. Those who saw them refused to speak of what they saw. The local priest wrote a single line in his ledger, then tore the page out. It has begun beyond the walls. In the capital, whispers turned to questions. Had the Queen died? Why had the bells not tolled? Why had no physician spoken? Ambassadors from Vienna, Naples, and Spain sent sealed letters, none of which received reply. Instead, the court issued a decree sterile in tone, empty in meaning that the Queen was recovering in privacy, and all matters of state would be conducted by the Council of Regents. Her image was removed from coinage. Her motto was scratched off from the palace gates. The balcony where she once stood to bless the harvest was shuttered. Curtains drawn. Always drawn. But the people knew. They knew in the way cattle refused to drink from the well nearest the palace walls, in the way dogs howled at sundown, scratching madly at locked doors, in the way bread molded overnight, and milk soured even in winter. They knew in the way dreams changed, filled now with corridors that stretched too long, doors that opened to dark cribs, infants who reached without eyes and called without mouths. They knew in the way breath came harder. The abbeys began holding daily cleansing rites, not for the body, for the air. Monks carried bowls of burning wormwood from cell to cell. Nuns lined their veils with salt. The psalms of the dying were sung at matins and vespers, not because anyone had died, not officially, but because something was passing through, and no one could name it. It was the archbishop who first spoke aloud what others only thought. At a closed gathering of bishops and physicians, he placed his trembling hands on the table and said, "If the soul is missing, but the breath remains, what then is the body? What then becomes of the air that leaves it?" No one answered. One man stood and left the room. Another vomited into his robes. In the days that followed, illness bloomed where the Queen had never set foot. A stable boy collapsed mid-stride, his arms covered in fine sores shaped like fingerprints. An old woman fell asleep during prayer and woke unable to speak, not from fear, not from pain, but because her tongue had vanished. A child wandered into the chapel garden and was found tracing circles in the dirt, whispering, "She's underneath." 3 guards, posted outside the sealed wing, reported a noise, not a scream, not a voice, but a sound like paper tearing beneath water. That night, one carved a hole in the wooden seal and pressed his eye to the gap. What he saw was never known, but his eye dissolved in its socket before morning. His name was struck from the registry. By now, the council had stopped meeting in full. Only fragments gathered at a time, never at night. Messages were passed by page, not by hand. The Chancellor wrote a memorandum suggesting the transfer of power be formalized. Count René of Lampsch, the Queen's cousin, refused. He argued it would constitute an admission of death, and such an admission would invite rivals from foreign courts. So long as she breathes, he wrote, we remain a throne. But no one, by then, believed the breath was hers. Rumours bloomed like fungus. Some said the child had never died, that it lived beneath the floorboards, feeding on the Queen from within. Others said it had returned to the womb, that the birth had never ended, that she lay still in labour, birthing breath, birthing silence, birthing the rot that now swept across the land. One monk recorded a dream he had for 7 nights, a hallway without end, lit by a lantern that burned without flame, and a woman at the far end, her belly moving, not with life, but with a rhythm that matched the beating of the earth. On the 8th night, he woke with dirt beneath his nails. The court physician, desperate for answers, petitioned to remove the Queen's body, or what remained of it, and burn it entirely. The Archbishop refused. She was crowned in sacred oil. He said, "We cannot turn sacred flesh to ash." But others were less reverent. The Duke of Chartres began sending coded letters to foreign princes, requesting ships. The walls of the chamber were reinforced again, this time with imported stone from the coast. When the workers arrived, they found black ooze seeping from the seams in the floor. One man touched it. His hand blistered and turned translucent. He died in silence, eyes wide, pupils shaped like crescents. Still, the breath came, every 7 days. A single note was left outside her door, a prayer, a verse, a name. None were taken, but each time, the parchment turned damp before morning. One was found half dissolved, the ink twisted into spirals, as if the page itself had tried to speak back. No one entered anymore. They listened instead, not with ears, but with skin. They felt it in the stone, in the bread, in their lungs, a weight that was not illness, but memory, a memory that did not belong to them, but used them anyway, used their mouths, their hands, their dreams, and so the kingdom began to crumble, not in war, not in rebellion, but in quiet, in breath, in the slow exhale of a name no one dared speak. Some endings are not written with ink. They are burned. They are whispered behind locked doors, signed in shaking hands, and buried beneath stone that no longer wants to remember. And so it was that the eastern wing of Château Sandeni, the place where the Queen had once walked, once bled, once breathed, was marked not for mourning, not for consecration, but for erasure. The decision came in the smallest of rooms, with the largest of silences. No full council, no proclamations, just a single night, cold and wet with mist, when 6 men stood beneath the vaulted ceiling of the northern chapel and passed between them a folded page unsigned, unsealed, unstamped. It contained no decree, only one sentence: she can no longer be named bearer of the crown. Her body is sealed, her spirit is cast out, yet the trace remains. Divide the inheritance by blood, erase her memory, destroy the wing. They did not speak after it was read. They did not raise their eyes. But each of them, the chancellor, the archbishop, the duke, the guard captain, the physician, and the Queen's own cousin placed their fingers against the paper in turn. And by morning, preparations had begun. It was not declared publicly. There were no wagons of firewood drawn through the streets, no scaffold, no torch parade, only oil thick, quiet, and heavy, carried by servants who did not ask why. They poured it along the base of the eastern wing, across the floors, up the beams, beneath the beds. Every window was covered, every mirror shrouded, every doorway nailed shut. The wing had already been silent for months. Now, it would be breathless. The carpenters did not return. The stonemasons who once reinforced the walls left the city at dawn. 2 monks vanished into the forest beyond the abbey and were never found. A novice, who had stood guard outside the chamber, left a single note beneath his pillow. I dreamed of her tongue. It was not hers. At dusk, the archbishop himself stepped forward. He wore no robes, only black wool, and his hands trembled as he struck the first match. The flames caught quickly, not with fury, but with knowledge. They climbed with purpose, as if they had rehearsed this path 1,000 times before, from floor to ceiling, from beam to rafter. The fire spread not like hunger, but like memory. And as the roof began to buckle and fall inward, those who watched swore they heard something from within, not a scream, not a voice, but a cry made of neither woman nor man. Something stretched between breath and silence. The fire burned for 5 hours. It did not stop for rain. It did not slow for stone. It consumed everything but the foundation. By morning, all that remained was ash, and one black mark at the center. Still warm, still smoking. Shaped not like a wound, but like a cradle. The chamber where her body had once been sealed was gone. No bones were found, no cloth, no trace. Only the impression of something once there, now pressed so deeply into the earth that even light refused to settle upon it. The royal records were rewritten. The Queen's name was erased from the line of succession. Her birth date struck through, her death date left blank. In its place, a single phrase was carved into the granite wall of the West Archive. She departed to the Lord in the times of silence and shadow. Her tomb in the royal crypt was never opened. No relics were preserved. No locket of hair. No mourning dress. Her heraldry was stripped from palace halls. The portraits burned. The weavers refused to speak her name when unpicking her emblem from the royal banners. The soldiers no longer bowed to her memory. The people were told, The monarchy remains in the hands of the council until a rightful heir appears. And that was all. But stone remembers, and Suda roots. In the ashes of the eastern wing, a garden was planted not by order, but by impulse. Wild herbs, thornless roses, a few solemn poplars, their trunks pale and smooth. But nothing grew. The soil remained dark, soft, sweet with something beneath the surface. No roots held, no leaves unfolded. Birds avoided it. Rain did not sink in, and so a wall was built around it. And on the map of the palace grounds, that space was marked simply terra morta, dead land. And still, she was not dead. Because in the abbeys, the cloisters, the silence between prayers, the old ones still whispered. They did not call her queen. They did not speak her name. But they said it. All the same. She did not die. She was burned. And yet, she breathes. Some graves are not dug in soil. They are dug in silence. In memory, in the empty space between what was and what remains. And sometimes when the name has been erased, when the stone has been scorched clean, when the line of blood has been severed, even then, the grave does not close. Not because it cannot, but because something beneath refuses. The eastern wing of Château Sandeni no longer existed. Where once there were windows, there was now a wall. Where once there were prayers, there was now only dirt. The garden planted in its ashes had withered, then vanished. The earth remained soft, but not yielding moist, but not alive. No roots held, no birds landed, even shadows passed around it. And yet, something was still there. The guards posted near the new boundary lasted no longer than before. One went blind without explanation. Another clawed at his own chest until his fingernails split. A third disappeared entirely, leaving behind only his boots, carefully placed side by side in the morning dew. Each time the post was reassigned, the orders grew shorter. Remain awake. Do not listen. Do not look. It should have ended. Boot endings require closure, and there had been none. The council had declared her erased. The church had performed their rites. The chamber had been sealed. The wing burned. The name unspoken. But something within that final breath, the one drawn before flame touched bone, before ash replaced presence had carried itself elsewhere. It showed itself first in the dreams of those who had stood in the chapel that night. The Chancellor dreamed of a door in the floor. It was locked from the inside. Each night, he descended a stair that never ended, his hands bleeding from holding a candle that burned too bright, too white. He died of fever 13 days later, his body found curled in a fetal position beneath his desk. The Archbishop, in his final winter, confessed to hearing a heartbeat beneath the stone of the altar. Not his own, not God's, something slower. He retired to a monastery in the north, where he whispered during sleep and clutched his rosary until his fingers broke. His last words were not prayer. Buta question, why does she still breathe in Count Rene? Heir apparent. Vanished. His carriage was found abandoned on the southern road, its wheels still spinning. Inside was a smear of black across the seat cushion, and in the corner, something small, wrapped in cloth, that none dared unwrap. It was buried in a lead box at midnight. The gravedigger asked new questions, but for weeks afterward, his children refused to enter the house, claiming mother sings from under the floor. Within the capital, things began to shift, not drastically, not openly, but in the small ways that mark the presence of what cannot be seen. Candles sputtered in chapels even without wind. Bread fell flat. Water took longer to boil. People began to avoid certain corners of the palace, not because of danger, but because of the cold, not the chill of air, but of memory, as if something in the stones still remembered breath. still remembered voice, still waited for a name to return. The scribes left a blank page at the end of the royal ledger. They did not write the queen's death. They did not write her burial. They did not write her name. But in the margin of the final page, written so faintly that it could only be seen in the candlelight between dusk and sleep, were 5 words. The tomb was never closed. And it wasn't, because in the quiet corners of the kingdom, in the flicker of lanterns on the road to Rouen, in the cracked walls of the abbey at Saint-Gilles, in the forgotten crypt, beneath the old cathedral where the air never warms, people still speak of her. Not as queen, not as mother, not even as woman, but as presence. They say she walks where no light stays lit, that she breathes through the mouths of sleeping infants, that she waits in doorways with no hinges, that her name is still carried in the wind, just behind the ringing of bells. No statue was ever carved for her, nor whomever written. No stone bears her likeness. But in the hush of certain hours, just before sleep, when the house is quiet and the breath is deep, there is a silence that does not feel empty. A silence shaped like a figure beneath sheets. A silence with eyes. She was born into darkness. She gave birth to decay. She was sealed in silence, burned in secrecy, and buried in breath. But she was never given rest, and so the kingdom forgot her name. But the earth did not. The tomb is still there, and it is still breathing.